Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar on how AI is taking over call centers and what that means for you. Before we get started, a couple of things. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation, so we ask that you submit questions via the send message link at the top of your screen. And feel free to do this anytime throughout the presentation. I'll be collecting these and pushing them out to our presenters once we're done. First, I will be introducing you to our speakers. I'm going to run through the agenda real quick, and then I will pass it over to our presenters to get started. So, to introduce you, today you will be hearing from Bill Piper. Bill is the president at Epic Connections. He's been there since 2003. He's got over 30 years of BPO industry experience and was honored by the Professional Association for Customer Engagement. Next, we have Tom Lewis, the CEO of Smart Action, which if you've attended any of our webinars in the past, you've definitely heard from him before. Tom was a former leader of Deloitte Call Center Advisory Practice and has over 28 years experience in contact center customer experience. Now for the agenda, for today's agenda, we're going to start by discussing why there's so much focus on AI and specifically why now. We're going to do a deeper dive into some of the components of AI self-service and try to give you a better understanding of the impact it can have on customer experience and your overall call center. And then again, as I mentioned before, we're going to end with the Q&A. So please enter your questions throughout the presentation anytime, and I will collect them up for our speakers when we finish. So now I'm going to pass over to Tom to get us started.
Awesome. Great. Well, so I think one of the places to start around this whole topic is really understanding what AI is. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but I think it's important from a foundational perspective to understand this as we go into the discussion. Because AI is hot. A lot of industries, a lot of companies are looking at how AI can impact their businesses and, frankly, how it's going to disrupt their businesses. To keep it simple for this discussion, the introduction of AI is really around introducing, a machine, introducing robots, introducing a purpose-built machine intended to achieve a specific activity with variable inputs and potentially variable outputs. It is not, just to be clear, this sort of ex machina or HAL from Space Odyssey or whatever full thinking and being machine. Now that may happen sometime, but I think as Bill and I will discuss today, for the purposes of the discussion today, it's really around these automation things. And I'll give you one analogy which you may have heard before, as Kim indicated on a prior webinar. If you think about the flight of a bird, and you think that that is something that man has been trying to recreate precisely for a very long time and really never been able to do so. But yet you think about an airplane, which man flies in all the time. The analogy is the flight of the bird is like artificial general intelligence, or this sort of future state that I was talking about, whereas the airplane is the purpose-built machine intended to achieve a specific result. And so today we're going to be talking about AI. So from a minimum wage increase, I think it's, we'll have some statistics around that, but I think it's interesting that when you think about the cost of running a call center, one of the challenges clearly is the cost of labor. And while any consultative discussion with a call center is often revolving around, well, we want to make sure we've got great customer experience and we've got options in front of us. Very often these days it's really around achieving that level of customer experience and satisfaction while simultaneously making sure that you are reducing the wage or cost, which, candidly, the cost of the agent is clearly the largest cost inside a call center operation. Now, my good friend Bill Piper is going to get us started with some discussions around the pressures and impacts that that's going to have on the call center environment. Bill?
Just to reiterate, the call centers today are really being forced to reevaluate how they do business. And we have in this slide 3 key areas. The first is minimum wages are increasing significantly, and I'll address this on the next slide. But the unit cost of servicing customers is continually increasing. In addition to minimum wages, operating costs are going up. The average cost for rental or lease arrangements is going up 3 to 5% a year. On top of that, you have agent turnover, which is also a significant cost with roughly 30 to 50% of the agents turning over every year. So these add up to some significant labor increases. Then on top of that, BPOs and captive call centers are getting pressure to do more with less. Clients as well as internal finance departments are creating this type of pressure. And with the number of customer interactions and costs rising, you know, the question is, how do you provide an excellent customer experience? And more, as we see in the third section of this slide, is that more and more people are choosing self-service and utilizing that to continue to improve the interaction or engagement with customers. And this allows the customer to use their channel of choice. So these are some of the pressures that we see on contact centers or call centers today. Kim, if you'll move to the next slide, we'll address that the changes in minimum wages. And as I mentioned, labor is the largest expense, and these increases are happening at alarming rates. For instance, California's minimum wage will increase 43% in less than 5 years. Oregon's will increase 38% over that same time period, and Maine will increase 33% in less than 3 years. So you can see that this will have a significant impact on call center costs and will result in involuntary attrition to stay within budget for contact center executives. And add to that, your tenured agents will request similar increases in wages due to not wanting to be paid the same wage as an entry-level agent. So as you can see here, the Heritage Foundation recently announced that these minimum wage increases, and this is just 5, there's many, many more, will eliminate approximately 300,000 jobs per year. Now, not all in the contact center space, but there will be a significant amount of contact center jobs affected by these increases in minimum wages.
So Bill, before you move on, between this slide and the last slide, when you're talking to your clients and advising them, you know, are these the concerns that your clients are raising to you? How am I going to deal with my labor problem? Is that front and center in a lot of your discussions with prospects and clients?
Yes, it really is, Tom. It's a real challenge today. The number one challenge that we hear over and over and over again is turnover, agent turnover. It's very expensive, and in order to get the right quality agents, organizations are having to pay more, while at the same time they're getting pressure to do more with less. So yes, to answer your question, labor is the biggest challenge that's facing contact centers today.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, and in my Deloitte days, my consulting days, that was a similar refrain, although based on your story here, it seems like it's getting worse. Now, one of the other challenges I often faced is when introducing technology or alternate solutions that, to develop a business case, you really needed to understand what the cost of your labor was. And sometimes people would say, well, I pay them $15 an hour, and so I divide that by 15 calls an hour, so it's $1 a call. And my sense is that that's not really correct. And I was wondering if you have a thought on how people should be thinking around true agent costs.
Actually, there's a real simple calculation on the cost per call, and that's depicted here in the middle. And that is taking the call center P&L and dividing that by the number of calls. So that's the real simple answer of what does it cost per call based on the number of calls that are received by agents throughout the year. But there's many other costs besides labor that are used for this calculation. So if I was to focus on 3 interrelated costs that have a significant impact, one would be workforce management, one would be training, and one would be recruiting. And I mentioned this on the previous slide, the number one challenge being turnover. Most centers, based on a research project by the Everest Group, said that most centers have 30 to 50% turnover, and the Human Capital Lab at Bellevue University also recently conducted a study for some large BPOs, and they determined the average cost of a turnover in a call center to be $5,500, $5,500. Now, some of these turns, Tom, actually happen during the training process. So they're not even on board a week or two, and they're turning over. And then the cost of recruiting, hiring, onboarding, training, coaching, managing, all of that is a significant impact. So if you looked at a typical 500-person call center, they could spend roughly $500,000 to $1.3 million a year in attrition-related costs. So that's just three of these things. We talked about hourly rates going up. Those three: workforce management, training, recruiting, significant expense. And then on top of that, look at all the other things that need to be factored in: quality, equipment, occupancy, software. So as you can see, the true costs per call has many factors that go into establishing what that cost is.
And that's not going to get better anytime soon. And so part of the thesis of our discussion today is, well, while you need to focus on better recruitment and better retention and training and all those other kind of things, if you can eliminate the need for some of those agents that you're otherwise having trouble to hire, that's and what I think you're going to find is that the introduction of new technology is going to lead you there. So whether it is artificial intelligence or whatnot, and so from an evolution perspective in automating what the agent does today, a long time ago, call deflection was the terminology, and people used DTMF or touch tone types of solutions. Then voice recognition was introduced, and finally natural language. Now, natural language not only includes the speech piece, but now as it continues to evolve is obviously what we refer to as the digital channel, so typing into chats or SMS or Facebook Messenger or whatever. And so when you think about all of that and then couple it with AI, I think there's an opportunity. Now, my impression, though, is that there is a lot of complexity and choices around the market, and so I think that's part of what you tend to advise people on, Bill.
Yeah, absolutely, and there are many choices as you've alluded to. And if you look at this graph on the top, we're giving you a visual depiction of the options as well as the respective capabilities of each. And along this continuum, some organizations are fine with DTMF. The company that sells the $10 widget is fine with DTMF being provided as a self-service solution. But when you get into more complex situations, you move up this continuum. And along with the capabilities, there's external expertise that's required as you move up that continuum. So, with DTMF, in the past, you set it and forget it, right? So, you implemented it, you put in the decision trees, and that was it, and it went along its merry way. But as more complex calls and engagements and interactions with customers evolve, then we move up this continuum. And then on top of that, in the bottom left, look at all the options you have. Cloud, tool set, SaaS, BaaS. Do I outsource? Do I do it on-prem? Do I do it myself? Do I use managed services? Just many, many options. So now that you've made a decision to improve self-service, you're now looking at the Rubik's Cube, if you will, of options. And then add to that the various steps in the process pictured on the right, determining what the scope is, any change orders, the fine-tuning, not only initially but ongoing. And then there's fees if you do it on-prem versus in a SaaS environment. Then you run into end of life, maintenance, updates, improvements, just a significant amount of things to consider when deploying these types of self-service options.
So what that means is, on the one hand, our thesis is technology is going to change, and there's a lot of things driving it, cost of labor, et cetera. But it can tend to be fairly complicated, and you know, you sort of have to be, even if you're not even in the call center industry, you've probably seen a lot of headlines around the introduction of AI, chatbots, virtual assistants, et cetera. And the confusion in the market is sort of highlighted by that last slide in terms of all the different options that somebody has to deal with. I'd like to try to simplify it a little bit in terms of the way to think about it, and I'm going to start with the voice channel. You know, when you think about the technology required to make AI work, you basically have two steps or two parts of it. One is the recognition. Did I hear what was said? And that's no small feat. In fact, that's one of the chief complaints around using voice-based systems, is that the machine doesn't necessarily understand what is being said. But getting past the recognition, then the next piece is the cognition. Do I know what to do with what was said? And so those two things combined make for a pretty advanced system. But I'd like to even go a little bit further, and Kim, if you want to go to the next slide, is talk about some of the advancements that are making this even more prevalent. And the first is the machine learning. And from a machine learning standpoint, the way I would think about this is that there are capabilities within both that recognition and cognition components that will make it so that as your business process evolves, that there are specific learnings that the system can take advantage of to make the following customer's experience even better. And then also the advancement of natural language processing, or NLP, and the ability of the computer to really break apart speech, understand grammar structure, and do that whether it's speech or whether it's what we've referred to as the digital channels, and make it so that the comprehension is much more contextual and much more easy to understand. In fact, from a natural language standpoint, let's dive into that just a little bit. So from a simplified explanation, in natural language, it's matching much more longer expressions or phrases and expanded version of a directed dialogue, and I'll talk about directed dialogue in just a minute. But allows you to essentially converse more naturally, to be able to use full sentences and convey, frankly, the objective or the intent of what it is you're trying to get across. But in the cases where what's spoken is pretty complex language structure, it should have the ability to deconstruct that sentence and be able to understand that intent and the way that the grammar was set up, but also understand the context. And this is part of where the natural language sort of merges with the cognition piece, is that, you know, if you make an expression, let's say, do you have anything earlier? Well, for those listening on the phone, you probably have no idea what the context of do you have anything earlier? Am I scheduling an appointment? Am I making a dinner reservation or whatever? And the idea is maintaining that whole comprehension throughout the conversation is part of the complexity of putting the AI with the natural language. So let me step back for just a second and just differentiate the natural language component from directed dialogue. Directed dialogue, I think we're all pretty familiar with, where you'll get a yes-no question, or perhaps it'll say billing, or say customer service, or say something. And the idea is that it's a very short one word or two words type of thing. And it's tuned or designed specifically to accept those kind of things. Now, one of the things that I think, Bill, might be worth discussing is within the call center arena, we're constantly looking for ways to improve the agent's performance by doing things like voice analytics. And so when it comes to voice analytics in the call center and machine learning and so forth, when you advise your clients, what's the main sort of advice or guidance that you give them around particularly the analytics technology?
So, Tom, today many high-performing call centers are using voice or speech analytics to improve that customer experience. But as it differs from AI and machine learning, what typically happens is the analytics determines the data that's actionable, and then it's incumbent upon the supervisor, the manager, the trainer to implement the necessary changes. So the challenge is that the people are slower than machines, frankly, right? And those changes may happen quickly. They may happen in the next coaching session 2 weeks from now, or it could happen today. But in most cases, it tends to be an elongated process. So yes, the high-performing call centers are using the voice and speech analytics, but the actionable data and the changes necessary are taking time to implement, which differs significantly from what you would get with AI or machine learning.
Yeah, I think that the thing that you highlight is the amount of effort, manual effort it takes to do this versus letting a machine sort of take over, particularly if it's guiding and coaching itself. One of my favorite examples is, imagine you had a relationship with a bank for 20 years and you walk into the bank and you walk up to the teller. Chances are good the teller has no idea who you are, whereas the advantage of having authenticated yourself upon entering into the system, whether it's through voice or another channel, and the system being able to not only analyze your relationship, but also anticipate what it is you need, and then compounded with taking the voice analytics piece into play, which allows you to sort of understand the trends and the market behaviors and so forth. It gets pretty sophisticated, but the advantage being that in a typical call center, you got to constantly monitor and use the voice analytics, where if it's set up from a machinery perspective, it should be part of the natural fabric of the environment. So again, getting pretty sophisticated.
That's exactly right.
So if you were in the call center industry, a year ago, you would have heard everybody talking about chatbots and bots of this, that, and the other thing. And then if you're an analyst or an investor, maybe about 6 months ago, you started to get a little bit shaky on whether it was going to reach the potential. And we have sort of a thesis on why we think that the excitement was hyped and then sort of the results maybe not quite as strong. And so part of it is that I think a lot of brands set up chatbots to in a way that sets the customer's expectation that it's going to have the answer to all the questions. Well, in an IVR that isn't the case, and so in a chatbot very often it's not the case either. It's maybe not much more than a glorified search engine or what have you. And so quickly the customer gets disillusioned and then picks up the phone anyway. And so I think one of the excuse me, one of the ways to think about the journey for chatbots and bots in general is to think about it actually very similar to the way that the IVR is constructed, if done properly. And the IVR has a very broad set of capabilities. You call in, how may I help you, if it's using natural language up front, and you say, well, I want to book a ticket, or I want to check my balance, or you want to whatever, I have a question, so forth. And then hopefully that transaction completes. If it doesn't, it goes to a live agent who is able to take advantage of the fact that you authenticated in the system, sees that you were asking a question about booking a ticket or so forth, and pick up the conversation from there. And essentially what I'm suggesting is that the same motif exists in a chatbot. It helps you where it can, and where it can't, it then transfers the chat over to a live agent to pick up where you left off. And so if you were asking about booking a ticket or checking your balance or what have you. And so it's the same kind of thing. Now, the difference is that over time, as you iterate around that and you solve this huge labor issue, that you take one process at a time, and eventually the chatbot and the IVR, if ideally on the same platform and the same AI and the same business rules and the same integration, means that one process at a time, you're actually eliminating those contact methods straight out of the call center. So the next two slides, I'm going to talk to the first one, and Bill's going to talk to the second one and give you some sense for what it is Smart Action and Epic do separately and together. And so what I've been describing is what we refer to as an OMNI-BOT. You're familiar with omni-channel, you're familiar with IVRs or voice bots, and you're certainly familiar with chat bots. And the idea is that once upon a time, maybe about a year or two ago, clients said to us, we love your IVR, artificial intelligence, voice bots thing, but I don't want to have to create all of that logic and integration and AI for my other digital channels. And so that was the genesis for creating what is now an OMNI-BOT. So it allows us to deliver to our clients a single business rule, signal integration, signal AI platform, and basically deploy it in all these channels simultaneously with the same business logic and exceptions and so forth. There are naturally some differentiations. For example, if you're doing SMS, we wouldn't take a credit card number. That's one simple example. There are other ones like on the voice channel where you might say, just to make sure I got that right, did you say X, Y, or Z? And in a chat, naturally, you just typed it in. So unless we couldn't find it, we probably wouldn't dialogue that way. So other than those changes, it's sort of a unique advantage, unique advancement in terms of the bot omni-channel world. And I think from an advisory perspective, Epic, in trying to solve the problem around the agent piece and the costs and the retention and all those kind of things. Bill, why don't you talk a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So there's a lot of dynamics in the call center industry today, and many talk about the customer experience or the customer journey. And when we look at that, the customers want to use, and I'll use the phrase easy button. They're looking for at least amount of effort in order to get the response to their inquiry as possible. And they also want to use their preferred channel. Is it a mobility channel? Is it a digital channel? Is it a voice channel? And they want fast and accurate responses. So those are the dynamics that we're facing today. And the contact center challenges, costs are increasing, and especially as we talked about labor, which is the biggest expense in the contact centers. And today there's limited channels. Typically we see voice plus 2 or voice plus 3, so voice plus IVR, email, and chat perhaps. Organizations are looking to add additional channels and drive customer adoption. And then, of course, you have the whole human capital side of this that's driving up costs around recruiting, hiring, onboarding, training, supervising, etc. And as you described on the previous slide, bots will only go so far, and then the customer will want to speak to an agent. So there are going to be agents with channel-specific skills that are needed, and those skills are going to be different. The written word skill versus the spoken word skill are different, and in most cases, contact centers are separating those skill sets and routing traffic that way. So we know that transforming your contact center can be some of the toughest work that you'll ever do, and these initiatives tend to be very high stakes and even higher visibility. And with Epic as your transformation partner, you'll be ensured of a great result for you, your contact center, your company, and your customers. And we will help you realize real results in this complex world of customer engagement.
Yeah, indeed. So with that, I'd like to wrap it up and invite you to contact either Bill or I, and our info is here on the screen. And Kim, I'm just curious if there were any questions that came in while we were talking.
Yeah, I got a couple. Tom, what's the simple one that came in earlier on in the presentation? Could you just explain what DTMF is?
Sure. All I meant by DTMF, although it has an acronym, In fact, Bill might even know, but basically what I mean is touch tone.
And then we have a question that came in just now about who do you know or do you have any examples of anyone using AI now successfully?
From my perspective, within the call center, given that our platform is in fact, our company started as an AI research company back in 2002, I can give you 100 examples. But one of the things that maybe would be helpful as opposed to who is to give a more concrete example of what. So imagine that within our entire customer base that you have some clients that want us to capture and validate a home address, for example. And so in our system, over the last many years, we have refined the process for capturing and validating using U.S. Postal Service or other criteria within the client's database, et cetera, and engaging the caller in that kind of conversation. That component or that capability is a purpose-built robot machine intended to achieve a specific outcome with variable input, just as I was describing from an AI perspective. But I can go one step further just briefly, and that is you can imagine that once upon a time, and after that was created, then another client came to us and said, well, can you handle Canadian addresses? And so we took that component and we expanded its capability, and because of our SaaS nature of our solution, that meant that every single one of our customers now have the ability to, without customizing their own application, to handle Canadian addresses.
Another question. Sorry, Tom, I think they're mostly going to be for you. They're about the tech. How does a system like this handle different languages and diction and accents? Is there a difference between a regular non-AI system?
Yeah, I think that's really in the recognition piece and on the voice channel specifically, I'm sure. And so one of the unique attributes is that the system is 100% natural language as opposed to the directed dialogue, which means that when we are tuning the system, we actually tune it with a very broad database. In fact, we use certified recordings from lots of different speakers. And so while you can say tomato and tomato and it understands, if it's really pretty far off in terms of the language, you're going to have problems with a human understanding that too. So there's a trade-off in there. If your demographic is heavily swayed towards sort of a dialect, then you can literally educate and inform and update the system to anticipate that. But generally speaking, does very well with those kind of accents and so forth because we've been doing that for a long time and tune the system to handle that.
Okay. What are the performance results you see when you're looking at AI versus a live agent?
Automation varies widely, and I think, and Bill probably can speak to this as well, in terms of the motivation of the caller and the complexity and expectations. And so if, for example, you're calling in the middle of the night and you have to do something and there's no live agent, and if you don't do it, then you got a problem, then you're highly motivated and your completion rate's going to be super high. If, on the other hand, you sort of got an idle question and want to chit-chat and maybe you're in prison and, it's your half-hour break that you get to be on the phone, then chances are good you're not going to want to use automation. And so I think that has a significant piece of it. The other is that most people's expectation around automation is fairly low. And there's a lot of reasons how we got here relative to that. And so it's very important early on in the conversation, and I would say this is true for a live agent as well, is to engage the caller in a way that indicates to them that you know what's going on. It's not as I often refer to it, as Dory from Finding Nemo, where it's the first time she's ever met you every time she meets you. And that's how typically IVRs are designed. And candidly, how a lot of agents are designed. Well, they may greet you by name. They make no assumptions that, are you calling about that explanation of benefits we sent in the mail yesterday or something else? And really, that personalization tends to entice people to engage more heavily with the system, which is what you want. And by the way, last point is that if they want to get out of the system, they should be able to do that too. There should be no sort of preconceived notion that you have to stay in the system. And in fact, if you design the system that way, then you probably need to rethink that.
Okay. We got a couple in, and so I'm going to try to condense this into one question, talking a lot about cost, and that you may be able to, in the long term, replace agents or supplement them, but Doesn't adding this new technology have exponential costs, and what about the staff to manage that tech and their wages? Aren't those going up as well? So a lot around that concept. If I think either of you, both of you, can speak on that.
Sure. I think there's clearly an opportunity cost here, and we've had two recent engagements with large insurance companies whose adoption rate in the IVR was single digits. One was 4 to 6%, the other was 7 to 9%, and the industry average in the insurance industry was around 40%. So what was happening was, because of the effort required in the self-service solution that they were providing to their policyholders, it was so cumbersome that they continually zeroed out. And when they zeroed out, they were talking to a fully loaded agent that cost the company $40,000 per year. So if you think about that cost, which is over $1 per minute, if they had stayed in the IVR, that would have been pennies per minute, and the customer would have been satisfied and not have to wait in queue for the next available agent, and the effort would have been a lot less. Therein lies what the opportunity cost is. If we're talking in the one example, a 9 to 10x adoption rate, which would allow for the agents to focus on the more complex calls, if you will, and not have to answer a call on what is the status of my claim, for instance. So from our perspective, it's not the cost of the technology, it's the opportunity cost, specifically around keeping the customer or the policyholder within the self-service solution.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that too. So Bill, very good point from the opportunity costs and the trade-offs and so forth. But I think there's also another dimension here, which is people are of a certain belief and in a paradigm that in order to introduce this technology, it's a monolithic project that takes 12 to 18 months, costs hundreds, if not millions of dollars, and creates disruption and so forth. And part of the solutioning this way, think of an analogy. We don't have guys running and operating elevators anymore. There was a disruption in the marketplace that allowed that elevators to run themselves. Well, there's a disruption in the marketplace that's changing the way self-service is working. And so not only can you typically, across all our customers, we implement in 70 days from the time the contract's signed to the time we take our first call, but the implementation cost is usually, I like to refer to it as the cost of a Hyundai, since that's one of our clients. So, put that in context. It's nowhere near the time, effort, or what have you that you typically think of for this technology. It's the democratization of AI and natural language come to everything from the small to medium business to the enterprise.
Perfect. If you have any questions for me particularly, you can reply to the emails, the invitations, the reminders, all that, and I'll get back to you. And that's about it. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Tom and Bill, thank you for presenting for me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Bill. See you.